Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the year is 2006. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a young animator who had just been fired from a television job he found creatively suffocating is sitting alone, channeling his frustration into something wonderfully chaotic. He opens his animation software, starts sketching two characters loosely modeled on Doc Brown and Marty McFly from Back to the Future, and begins recording voices. The voices come out strange and funny and slightly unhinged. He's not really thinking about legacy or franchise. He's thinking about how funny it would be to deliberately annoy a team of corporate lawyers. And from that petty act of creative rebellion, one of the most layered and beloved animated universes in television history was born. That is the honest, slightly ridiculous origin of Rick and Morty. And the deeper you look into how it came to exist, the stranger and more interesting the whole story gets. Fact 1. Rick and Morty was co-created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, and the two of them first met at Channel 101, a non-profit monthly short film festival in Los Angeles that Harmon had co-founded. Roiland began submitting content to the festival around 2004, roughly a year after it launched. His early work leaned heavily into shock value and what he called sick and twisted elements. Most audiences were confused by his submissions, but Harmon was immediately drawn to the energy behind them, and the two began collaborating. Fact 2. The direct predecessor of Rick and Morty was a crude animated short called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, which Roiland made in 2006 as an act of creative defiance. At the time, how he was receiving cease and desist letters from Bill Cosby's lawyers over another Channel 101 project he had been working on called House of Cosbys. That show revolved around a man who cloned Bill Cosby multiple times and lived with the duplicates. It ran for 5 episodes before Cosby's legal team shut it down. Roiland, apparently not satisfied with one copyright dispute, decided the logical response was to create a deliberately offensive parody of Back to the Future to see if he could provoke the lawyers of a different intellectual property. The result was Doc and Marty. Fact. 3. Dan Harmon described the original Doc and Marty short as, in his words, a bastardization and a pornographic vandalization. It is exactly as described. The short featured Doc Smith pressuring Marty to perform explicit acts in exchange for access to time travel technology. Despite its content, audiences at Channel 101 reacted with wild enthusiasm, and Roiland found himself drawn back to the two characters again and again, creating more shorts that slowly began to move beyond the original shock value concept. Fact 4. Here is one of those small details that seems insignificant, but actually shaped the sound of the entire show. While Roiland was editing the audio for Doc and Marty, he became genuinely fascinated with the voices he had created for the two characters. He hadn't planned them out meticulously. They emerged organically during the recording, and something about the way Doc's voice slurred and stuttered and Marty's voice wavered with nervous energy struck Roiland as something worth preserving. That's when he shifted his thinking. What had started as a provocation against copyright lawyers became a vehicle for exploring two characters he genuinely found compelling. Fact 5. Between 2006 and 2012, Roiland continued doing voice work and animation projects while occasionally revisiting the Doc and Marty characters in various forms. The voices became a kind of running and joke among his creative circle. Harmon, meanwhile, created and ran Community, the beloved NBC sitcom, and became one of television's most discussed writer-showrunners. The two men stayed in contact but hadn't yet found the right project to pursue together. Fact 6. In 2012, Dan Harmon was briefly fired from Community after creative tensions with the show's studio. It was a disruptive and painful period for him professionally. That same year, Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, known for its experimental and often subversive animated content, approached Harmon about developing a new show. Initially, Harmon wasn't sure the network was the right fit for his creative style. He tended to work in dense character-driven narratives built around dialogue, which felt like a different world from the often absurdist, image-heavy humor Adult Swim was known for. He also had no significant background in animation, which made him hesitant. Fact 7. Rather than pitch something entirely new, Harmon picked up the phone and called Roiland. He asked if Roiland had any ideas for an animated series. Roiland immediately and without hesitation brought up Doc and Marty. He suggested they rename the characters and build a proper show around them. The new names, Rick and Morty, carried the same rhythm and alliterative energy as Doc and Marty, while stepping far enough away from the Back to the Future references to avoid legal complications. Fact 8. The entire first draft of the Rick and Morty pilot was written in approximately 6 hours. This isn't a legend that grew through retelling, it's a documented fact. Harmon and Roiland wrote it together on the Paramount Pictures lot, inside what was described as Harmon's unfurnished community office. The space had almost nothing in it. 2 people, a mostly empty room, and 6 hours. And the result became the foundation for one of the most dense and carefully constructed animated universes ever put to television. Fact 9. Roiland's original vision for the show was actually quite modest. He had imagined it running as a single 11-minute segment per episode rather than a full half-hour program. Adult Swim, however, pushed strongly for the half-hour format, sensing that the concept had more room to breathe and grow than a shorter runtime would allow. Harmon agreed with the network's instinct and felt the best way to fill that extra time was to build an entire family structure around the 2 lead characters. Fact 10. The decision to make Rick specifically Morty's grandfather, rather than simply an older friend, came from Adult Swim development executive Nick Weidenfeld. But this single suggestion shifted the entire emotional landscape of the show. A grandfather-grandson relationship carries different weight than a simple mentorship. It implies decades of history, family obligation, generational tension, and a strange tenderness that can coexist with dysfunction. The entire emotional core of the series flows from that one suggestion made during development conversations. Fact 11. Before Rick and Morty, Roiland had pitched 3 separate animated pilots to Fox, all of which failed to get off the ground. By the time Adult Swim came calling, he had developed what he described as a kind of burnout toward pitching television ideas. He had grown frustrated with the process of presenting something he cared about and watching it disappear into a development void. The success of Rick and Morty, which moved from pitch to premiere with unusual speed and purpose, was a reversal of fortune that genuinely surprised him. Fact 12. Rick's distinctive burping speech pattern was not planned from the beginning. According to Roiland, the burp style emerged during the recording of the original pilot, when he spontaneously began swallowing air and inserting burp sounds between every line. He spent roughly 4 hours in the recording studio doing burp takes for every single piece of Rick's dialogue. When he brought the audio to Harmon, the co-creator's immediate response was that there were far too many burps, and the whole thing was, in his words, disgusting. Most of the burps were cut. What survived became one of the most recognizable vocal signatures in all of animated television. Fact 13. The show premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013. The first season consisted of 11 episodes and was received with immediate critical enthusiasm. By the time the season wrapped, Rick and Morty had become one of the most watched programs Adult Swim had ever produced. The network, which had taken a gamble on Harmon despite his lack of animation experience, found itself with a genuine phenomenon on its hands. Plans for renewal were essentially already underway before the final episode of the first season even aired. Fact 14. Dan Harmon has described Rick and Morty as a cross between Matt Groening's 2 most famous creations, The Simpsons and Futurama, in the sense that it balances domestic family drama with high-concept science fiction. But his stated influences go significantly further. The show's tone is heavily informed by British storytelling traditions, particularly the absurdist world-building of Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the vast narrative scope of Doctor Who. Harmon has also mentioned the cult science fiction film Zardoz, and even the theoretical writings of evolutionary anthropologist Elaine Morgan as points of intellectual inspiration. Fact 15. One of the quieter and most persistently interesting facts about the show's creation is that the original Doc and Marty short was never shown to the producers at Adult Swim during the development of Rick and Morty. Roiland was genuinely worried that if the network executives saw the source material, they might have concerns about the direction of the project or the people behind it. He was protective of the new show's chances and kept the connection between Doc and Marty and Rick and Morty deliberately obscure during the early stages. Plans were even floated at one point to include the Doc and Marty characters as members of the Council of Ricks, but this idea was eventually dropped. Fact 16. The original version of Morty that Harmon and Roiland pitched was a notably different character from the Morty audiences came to know. In early development, Morty was conceived as much more of what storytellers call a punching bag, a character whose primary function was to absorb whatever abuse and chaos Rick directed at him. He had less agency, less emotional depth, and less of the quiet moral conscience that ended up defining him. Some Adult Swim executives pushed back on this version, and the character was substantially rewritten into the more fully realized Morty of the finished show, one who is afraid but also capable of genuine courage and pushback. Fact 17. The show uses a writing process centered around what Harmon has called the story circle, an 8-step narrative framework he developed as his own adaptation of Joseph Campbell's famous monomyth, commonly known as the hero's journey. Every character in a given episode moves through the circle. They exist in a state of comfort, then something disrupts that comfort. They cross into an unfamiliar world, they adapt to it, they find what they were looking for, they pay a price for it, they return to where they came from, and they are changed by the experience. This structure repeats at multiple levels within a single episode, often running simultaneously for the A-plot and the B-plot. It gives even the most chaotic-seeming episodes a sense of underlying order that viewers feel without necessarily being able to articulate. Fact 18. In 2018, Adult Swim signed a deal ordering 70 new episodes of Rick and Morty, spread across an unspecified number of seasons. This was described at the time as one of the largest episode orders in the history of Adult Swim. It essentially secured the show's future for years and gave the writing staff the freedom to plan longer arcs, introduce more complex serialized storytelling, and take bigger narrative risks without worrying about cancellation. As of the time this script was recorded, the show has been renewed through season 12, with additional episodes bringing the total order even higher. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching this, and what time it is. I genuinely love seeing where these videos reach. And if you haven't subscribed yet, a gentle tap on that button means everything and keeps this channel going. Section 2. Rick Sanchez, The Architecture of a Broken Genius. Facts 19 to 37. There is something uniquely compelling about characters who contain contradictions at their very core. Rick Sanchez is, by essentially every available measure, the most powerful and capable individual in any room he walks into, and across most of the infinite universe the show inhabits. He is also, beneath every layer of nihilism and sardonic wit and performative indifference, one of the most deeply wounded and emotionally compromised characters in all of modern animation. Understanding Rick means holding both of those things at once without letting either one cancel the other out. Fact 19. Rick Sanchez is canonically identified as Rick C-137, which refers to the dimension from which he originates. Dimension C-137 is one of the infinite universes within the show's multiverse, and the designation C-137 has become shorthand within the fandom and within the show itself for the specific Rick and Morty that the audience follows across the series. Other Ricks at the Citadel recognize this designation and treat it with a mixture of respect and wariness, because C-137's Rick has a reputation as what other characters sometimes call a terror Rick. Fact 20. The backstory of Rick C-137 was one of the most carefully guarded mysteries of the early seasons. Hints were dropped, contradictions were planted, and fans debated for years about what was real and what was fabricated. The full picture emerged slowly across multiple seasons. In Dimension C-137, Rick was not always the cold and nihilistic figure audiences meet at the start of the show. He was once a relatively ordinary man, a scientist working on difficult problems, married to a woman named Diane, and the father of a daughter named Beth. He lived a middle-class life and had a genuine warmth for his family that he didn't feel the need to hide. Fact 21. The event that shattered Rick's life and that ultimately explains almost everything about who he became was a visit from an alternate version of himself. A Rick from another dimension, the one the show eventually names Rick Prime, arrived in C-137's garage and offered him the formula for interdimensional travel. This was an extraordinary gift. access to infinite realities, infinite possibilities. But C-137's Rick turned it down. Not because he didn't understand the science. He understood it perfectly. He turned it down because he had a family, and the family mattered more to him than the power. Fact 22. Rick Prime, insulted by what he perceived as weakness and possibly driven by a desire to punish the version of himself who had chosen attachment over ambition, dropped a bomb through a portal into the garage of C-137's home. The bomb was meant for Rick. Instead, it killed Diane and Beth. The explosion that was meant to destroy one Rick's body instead destroyed another Rick's entire reason for living. The grief that followed was total. And from that grief, C-137's Rick built himself into something that could never be touched again. Fact 23. And after the deaths of Diane and Beth, Rick C-137 dedicated his existence to hunting down Rick Prime across the infinite multiverse. This hunt lasted decades. He invented his own version of portal technology, which made him one of only 2 Ricks to develop it independently rather than receive it from Rick Prime. He fought wars, built alliances, made enemies out of entire civilizations, and killed other versions of himself when they crossed his path. The version of Rick that moves into Beth's garage at the start of the series is not the man who existed before that garage bomb. He is something that was built in the crucible of catastrophic grief and absolute determination. Fact 24. In a detail that reveals the depth of Rick's private anguish when he returned to Dimension C-137 at one point in the later seasons, once it was discovered that he had placed the entire dimension on a time loop. The loop repeated the day that Diane and Beth were killed, over and over, for decades, trapping everyone in that reality, including his neighbor, Mr. Goldman Bach-Majorian, in a perpetual moment just before his world ended. Rick eventually released the loop, giving the dimension's inhabitants what the show frames as the relief of death. It is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire series. Fact 25. Rick Prime also used a device called the Omega device to erase Diane Sanchez from every single reality across the multiverse. The Omega device doesn't just kill its target in one dimension. It removes them from all of existence simultaneously, including from the memories of people who knew them in other realities. By the time Rick C-137 finally tracked down and killed Rick Prime in the episode called Unmortrican, Diane had been erased from every dimension. There was nowhere left to find her. The revenge was complete, but the grief had nowhere left to go. Fact 26. After exhausting his search for Rick Prime, C-137's Rick eventually settled in what he believed was Rick Prime's original home dimension, the dimension that audiences first knew as C-137, but which was later clarified to be the Cronenberg dimension, the one where Morty accidentally mutated every human into horrific creatures in a Season 1 episode. Rick moved into that dimension and took up residence with Rick Prime's Morty, Beth, Summer, and Jerry, waiting for Rick Prime to eventually return home. Rick Prime never returned, because he had no attachment to home. And Rick C-137, surrounded by a family that wasn't technically his, found himself falling into an unexpected and complicated love for them anyway. That is where the show begins. Fact 27. Rick's relationship with alcohol is one of the show's most consistent background details. He is almost never seen without a flask or a drink nearby. This isn't purely comedic coloring. The show treats Rick's alcoholism as an extension of his emotional damage, a numbing mechanism for a man who feels too much but has decided to feel nothing. The flask is always there, in his hand or in his coat, visible in the background of scenes where he appears to be engaged in something entirely unrelated. Fact 28. Rick's intelligence is consistently presented as not just the most extreme on the show, but among the most extreme in the entire universe. Now, he can build devices that entire galactic civilizations cannot replicate. His portal gun allows him to travel between any of the infinite dimensions at will. He has built artificial intelligence systems sophisticated enough to mimic the voice and personality of his dead wife. He has defeated entities described as gods. He once turned himself into a pickle to avoid going to family therapy, which is arguably one of the most overcomplicated ways in history to cancel an appointment. Fact 29. The Pickle Rick episode, which aired in Season 3 and won the show its first Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, began its life as a single throwaway suggestion in the writer's room. Someone said, "What if the episode started with Rick turning himself into a pickle?" The room latched onto it. The next question was, why would he do that? And the answer that made the most thematic sense was because he could. And because it was another one of his elaborate mechanisms for avoiding the difficult, boring work of being emotionally present for his family. The episode was written by Jessica Gao, and the therapist character, Dr. Wong, was specifically written to be played by an Asian actor. Susan Sarandon was available and given the role, with the character's name kept unchanged despite the casting shift. Fact 30. Rick has an irrational and deeply unexplained fear of pirates. This is revealed as a one-off joke in the episode The Rick and Morty Date, where Rick tells the President of the United States that his intelligence file on him is wrong about almost everything, but panics when the President mentions pirate-themed secret operations, acknowledging that part is actually true. Why the smartest man in the universe is specifically afraid of pirates has never been explained. It is possible the show never intends to explain it. Sometimes a mystery is more interesting than an answer. Fact 31. Rick's relationship with Bird Person is one of the few genuine emotional anchors in his life. The two met through shared resistance against the Galactic Federation, fighting together in what the show implies were extended and brutal conflicts. Bird Person saw Rick at his most vulnerable and stayed. He is one of the only characters who consistently speaks to Rick with the kind of directness that comes from genuine intimacy, pointing out his drinking, his self-destructive behavior, his emotional unavailability, without ever losing the loyalty that makes him worthy of Rick's trust. Fact 32. But when Bird Person was turned into Phoenix Person by the Galactic Federation, the event devastated Rick in a way that the show handles with unusual restraint. There are no dramatic speeches or extended grief sequences. Rick simply has to continue knowing that the one person who stayed loyal to him has been turned into a weapon aimed at everyone Rick cares about. The show leaves the emotional weight largely unspoken, trusting the audience to feel it without being told what to feel. Fact 33. Rick's vanity card at the end of episodes, through the production company called Justin Roiland's Solo Vanity Card Productions, always featured a simple and brief animated logo. But Dan Harmon's own production company, Harmonious Claptrap, had a closing card that changed significantly between seasons. During seasons 1 and 2, the card showed a warm domestic scene with Harmon sitting happily with his wife and their pets. After Harmon's divorce in 2015, the card for season 3 changed to show him alone on a couch, surrounded by vodka bottles and garbage, still accompanied by his animals. It is one of the most quietly human Easter eggs hidden in the show, a real person's real grief embedded into the closing seconds of an animated comedy. Fact 34. Rick keeps a box in his garage labeled time travel stuff, and it sits on a shelf collecting dust. The show's writers have confirmed that this is an intentional in-joke. Both Harmon and Roiland have expressed a genuine creative distaste for time travel as a narrative device, feeling that it too easily undermines story stakes and character consequences. The box on the shelf is the show's way of literally shelving the idea, keeping it visible but permanently out of reach. Fact 35. Despite being voiced by Justin Roiland for the first 6 seasons of the show, Rick's distinctive burping style and slurred speech patterns were not something Roiland did naturally. They required significant physical effort. For the original pilot, he spent approximately 4 hours swallowing air to produce the burps, leaving him with a severe stomach ache by the end of the session. The show's writers describe having to carefully calibrate the number of burps per scene, ensuring that the affectation reads as characterful rather than overwhelming. Fact 36. In an episode that many fans cite as one of the most revealing character moments in the series, Rick builds an artificial intelligence using recordings of Diane's voice and installs it in his house in Dimension C, 137. The AI exists essentially to haunt him, calling to him from the next room in Diane's voice, a constant reminder of his failure to save her and a pressure to continue his search for revenge. When Rick finally releases the time loop that had been trapping the dimension and prepares to move on from his grief, his encounter with the Diane AI is the show's clearest articulation of how long he had been punishing himself by refusing to heal. Fact 37. Rick's signature catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," which became one of the most recognizable phrases associated with the show in its early seasons, was revealed in the episode Rixie Business to have a specific meaning in the language of Bird Person's people. And when Morty enthusiastically uses the phrase, Bird Person informs him that in his culture, it translates roughly to, "I am in great pain, please help me." The phrase, which had seemed like pure nonsense, becomes one of the show's earliest signals that Rick's performative fun and reckless energy is a surface covering something much more raw and honest underneath. Section 2.5. Rick's voice, his world, and his relationships with power. Additional Rick facts before we move forward. Before we fully move on from Rick, there are several threads that deserve their own space rather than being squeezed into the larger sections. The character contains so many layers of specifically constructed detail that even a thorough treatment leaves things behind. Rick's signature color scheme. The white coat and the teal hair and the slightly blue-gray skin tone that suggests someone who spends very little time outdoors was not accidental. Character designers worked through multiple iterations of how to make him look simultaneously brilliant and broken. The slightly desaturated quality of his skin, suggesting a man whose self-care is at the very bottom of his priority list, is one of those details that operates subliminally. You don't notice that he looks unwell exactly, but you register something about his physical presentation that communicates his internal state before he opens his mouth. Rick's lab coat, which appears to be always the same one, or at least always replaced by an identical version, has something of the quality of a uniform. It serves the same psychological function as scrubs or a military uniform. Now, it announces his identity before he says anything. It is the visual signal that this is a scientist, a person defined by what he knows rather than by who he loves. The fact that he wears it at family dinners, at parties, during alien weddings, at the end of the universe, reinforces that the scientist identity is not a role he puts on and takes off. It is the costume he chose and then forgot he was wearing. Rick builds things the way some people breathe. Automatically, constantly, not always with a clear destination in mind. The garage is full of projects in various states of completion that the show has never explained. Some of these are clearly weapons. Some appear to be communication devices. Some look like they might be vehicles of some kind. Rick does not tidy the results of his compulsive invention. That he builds until he stops building and then begins something else. The garage is the physical representation of a mind that cannot rest. The portal gun, which is arguably the most important single object in the show's universe, operates on principles the show deliberately keeps vague. The fluid that powers it is finite and requires replenishment. The portal it opens can be targeted at any dimension Rick chooses, which implies he has a mapping or indexing system for the infinite multiverse stored somewhere that the show has never fully explained. Whether that index is in the gun itself, or in Rick's head, or in some external system he maintains, is never specified. The gun is treated as miraculous precisely because the audience is never told exactly how it works. Rick's drinking, as mentioned, is constant. But there are moments across the series where the drinking is clearly not about pleasure or even habit. It is about maintaining a level of chemical sedation that keeps whatever is underneath from surfacing during the wrong moment. The most revealing instances are the moments when Rick is under extreme emotional stress, and the drinking becomes frantic rather than casual. Those moments are filmed differently from the scenes of ordinary drinking, and the show expects the audience to notice the difference. His relationship with Morty exists in a constant tension between genuine love and habitual exploitation. Rick uses Morty. This is not hidden. He says it, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes through actions that make it impossible to misinterpret. But the show is equally clear that the exploitation is not the whole of what Rick feels for Morty. There are moments of genuine tenderness, genuine pride, genuine grief at the thought of losing him that cannot be entirely explained, as Rick valuing a useful tool. Whatever Rick feels for Morty exists somewhere between fatherhood and friendship and a complicated debt of gratitude for being allowed to love someone again after choosing not to. Section 3. Morty Smith and the Weight of Ordinary Courage. Facts. 38 to 56. There is a tendency when writing about Rick and Morty to spend the majority of analytical energy on Rick. He is louder, more immediately striking, more packed with obvious dramatic material. But Morty Smith is arguably the character through whom the show finds its emotional center, and the more carefully you look at him, that's the more interesting and surprising he becomes. Fact 38. Morty Smith is 14 years old at the start of the series. He is described by his father Jerry in an early episode as having a slight mental disability, though this framing is presented as one more example of Jerry's self-interested condescension, rather than as an actual diagnosis the show endorses. What Morty actually has is anxiety, insecurity, and the kind of moral sensitivity that makes him feel everything deeply. These are not disabilities. In the context of the show, they are actually his most significant strengths, even if they rarely feel that way to him. Fact 39. The technical reason Rick gives for specifically taking Morty on adventures, rather than Summer or any other companion, is that Morty's brainwaves have a unique property. They produce a neural pattern that, when Morty is in proximity to Rick, effectively cancels out the distinctive signature of Rick's genius-level intellect. This makes Rick essentially invisible to systems and entities that scan for abnormal intelligence. Morty is, in this framing, human camouflage for the most conspicuous brain in the multiverse. Fact 40. Morty's experience of going on adventures with Rick across multiple seasons leaves unmistakable marks on him. He develops reflexive combat skills, an expanded understanding of violence and mortality, and a progressively more complicated relationship with ethics. The show does not present this evolution as straightforwardly good. Every time Morty becomes slightly more efficient or slightly less troubled by the things he has to do, the camera tends to frame it as a warning rather than a milestone. But the closer Morty gets to Rick's emotional detachment, the more the show positions it as damage rather than growth. Fact 41. The show contains an episode in which Morty has access to a device that allows him to selectively erase memories. When Rick and Morty accidentally discover a shelf in Rick's garage filled with memory vials that Morty himself doesn't recognize, they investigate and discover that Morty has been systematically erasing traumatic memories from his adventures. The revelation is that the experiences have been so consistently awful that Morty has quietly been performing a kind of emotional self-surgery just to keep functioning. He has erased so much that there are massive gaps in his self-understanding. His coping mechanism has become a form of slow self-erasure. Fact 42. The concept of evil Morty, one of the most beloved and discussed characters in the show's mythology, was introduced as a twist at the end of the season, one episode close Rick counters of the Rick kind. Throughout the episode, audiences had been following what appeared to be a rogue Rick who was kidnapping and torturing other Mortys across the multiverse. The reveal was that this Rick was being remotely controlled by a Morty, who had been hiding in plain sight among the group of rescued Mortys the whole time. Evil Morty simply walked away. No confrontation, no declaration. He just disappeared back into the crowd and kept moving. Fact 43. Evil Morty is explicitly presented as what a Morty can become when the anxiety, hesitation, and moral sensitivity that define the character are stripped away through accumulated experience and deliberate choice. He is calm, patient, and utterly unbothered by suffering, including the suffering of other Mortys. His entire arc culminates in his escape through the central finite curve, the interdimensional barrier that separates the dimensions where Rick is always the smartest person in the universe from the dimensions where the rules are different. Evil Morty's escape is the show's clearest articulation of what happens when someone at the absolute bottom of a power structure decides they are done with it. Fact 44. The central finite curve itself is one of the most significant pieces of world building the show ever introduced. It is essentially a wall built by Ricks across the multiverse to enclose only those dimensions, where Rick is always the most capable, most powerful, most dominant entity, and every person in every dimension inside the curve lives in a reality that was architecturally designed to ensure Rick stays on top. Morty, Beth, Jerry, Summer, and every version of them exist inside a universe that was deliberately shaped by genius-level narcissism. Evil Morty's escape to beyond the curve represents a rejection of that entire system. Fact 45. Morty's voice actress before the recasting was Justin Roiland, who voiced both characters simultaneously throughout the first 6 seasons. The trick of voicing two characters who are frequently in conversation with each other required Roiland to essentially perform both sides of dialogues back and forth, often solo in a recording booth. The two characters record separately from each other in the post-Roiland era, with Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden not recording together, and the interactions between them are constructed in post-production. Harry Belden has mentioned in interviews that after recording sessions, his internal mental voice stays in Morty's register for the rest of the day, and he cannot turn it off. Fact 46. Morty's relationship with his crush Jessica is one of the show's most persistent running elements in the early seasons. Jessica represents the life Morty could theoretically have: ordinary, recognizable, not involving alien parasites or dimensional collapse. His inability to connect with her without falling apart communicates something specific. Not just that he's a nervous teenager, but that the version of himself who could smoothly navigate normal social interactions has been progressively replaced by someone who has survived things that most people would find incomprehensible. A normal teenage life and the life Morty actually leads are becoming increasingly incompatible. Fact 47. In the episode Morty's Mind Blowers, an alien tortoise that can perceive total truth tells Morty something so devastating that Morty immediately asks Rick to erase the memory. The show never reveals what the tortoise said. The episode then builds an entire story around the consequences of Morty's memory erasures without ever returning to the original inciting secret. The specific content of what the tortoise revealed is never disclosed across the entire run of the series. This is either an intentional permanent mystery or a detail the writers have kept reserved for a future episode. Fact 48. Morty Prime, the specific Morty that the audience follows throughout the series. It is actually Rick Prime's biological grandson, rather than Rick C-137's. This was clarified in the later seasons when it was revealed that C-137's dimension never had a Morty because Rick Prime had killed Beth and Diane before Summer and Morty could be born. The Morty in the show comes from the Cronenberg dimension, which was Rick Prime's original home. Rick C-137 essentially adopted Rick Prime's family. The Morty running through alien planets and moral crises with Rick C-137 is technically not his own grandson at all. But it does not feel that way. Not to either of them. Fact 49. The episode Rixie Business, which serves as the Season 1 finale, ends with Rick and Morty dancing together to the song Goodbye Moonman. The song was written specifically for the show and performed by Jermaine Clement. It is simultaneously a piece of in-universe alien entertainment and a genuinely affecting musical moment because of the way it frames the relationship between the two characters. For all the chaos and danger and moral compromise, there are moments of genuine joy between them, and this is one of the clearest examples. Fact 50. Morty has a younger sister, Summer, who is older than Morty by a couple of years. The show often presents Summer as the more emotionally stable and socially capable sibling, but later seasons reveal that this is partly a performance, a kind of defensive coolness built over a deeper anxiety about belonging and worth. Summer's eventual integration into the adventure side of the show comes specifically because she cannot stand being left out. And the reason she cannot stand it connects directly to a revelation about her birth that the show handles with unusual directness and emotional weight. Fact 51. Morty's brainwave pattern that makes him useful to Rick is described in the show as being able to cancel out the genius wave. This is a piece of pseudoscience that the show presents without apology, but what makes it interesting is the deeper implication. Morty is useful precisely because he is ordinary. In a universe of extraordinary people and entities, Morty's straightforwardness is itself a form of power. He is the thing the smartest man alive needs in order to survive. Fact 52. The show repeatedly revisits the question of whether Morty is actually ordinary or whether spending years in proximity to Rick has made him something altogether different. By the later seasons, Morty demonstrates combat reflexes, strategic thinking, and a capacity for difficult moral decisions that an average 14-year-old would simply not have. He has buried himself in a different dimension. He has watched civilizations fall. He has killed. The question of whether the boy inside is still intact is one the show never fully resolves, because it doesn't want to. Fact 53. In one episode, when Morty gets the chance to lead his own adventure and chooses what appears to be a simple, low-stakes destination, it all goes catastrophically wrong in ways that highlight exactly why Rick tends to be the one in charge. But the emotional resonance of the episode comes from watching Morty try. He didn't ask for Rick to save him. He wanted to prove he could do it. The failure is not just comedic, and it is the show examining what happens when courage outpaces capability, and why that particular kind of bravery still deserves to be respected, even when it produces disaster. Fact 54. Morty has been confirmed by the show's writers to have developed what would clinically be understood as post-traumatic responses to his experiences over the seasons. He flinches at loud sounds. He has nightmares. He dissociates during moments of calm. The show presents these not as character flaws, but as the expected and honest consequences of the life Rick has pulled him into. Every time audiences see these responses, it is a reminder that the cost of interdimensional adventure is real and ongoing, and that Morty is paying it quietly, mostly without anyone noticing. Fact 55. Wubba lubba dub dub is Morty's favorite phrase in the early seasons before he learns its actual meaning from bird person. He uses it enthusiastically at parties and during adventures, treating it as a kind of victory chant. The moment where he learns what it actually means lands differently depending on what the viewer knows about Rick's backstory at the time of watching. Rewatching the early episodes with the knowledge of Diane's death and Rick's decades of grief transforms the catchphrase from nonsense into an accidental act of profound and painful honesty. Fact 56. Harry Belden, who took over the role of Morty from Justin Roiland starting with Season 7, was described by showrunner Scott Marder as having been found after exhausting every possible resource during the casting search. Cardoni, who plays Rick, was cast first. So Belden came later, and his name was not revealed until the Season 7 premiere itself. Both actors were kept apart from each other during the search, and Belden's agents tricked him into a Zoom call by describing it as a strange project before revealing that he had been cast as Morty Smith. He described the moment as one he had literally dreamed about. Section 4. The Smith household, where every room is a study in damage. Facts 57 to 74. The Smith family home in the fictional suburb of Seattle, Washington is, on the surface, an utterly ordinary American house. Two-story, modest yard, connected garage that doubles as a laboratory containing technology that could rearrange the fabric of reality. Underneath the surface, every member of the Smith household is carrying a specifically shaped emotional wound. And the show treats each of those wounds with more care and attention than the comedy exterior might suggest. Fact 57. Beth Smith was not always meant to be a horse surgeon. In early development discussions, various professional backgrounds were considered for her. The horse surgeon detail was eventually chosen partly because of the comedic incongruity of a woman with clearly high intelligence and ambition directing her skills toward an animal specialty rather than human medicine, and partly because it serves the show's deeper portrait of Beth as someone who chose stability over potential. She is brilliant. She chose to not be brilliant in the most conspicuous way possible, and the show tracks the resentment that decision produces across multiple seasons. Fact 58. Fact. Beth's relationship with Jerry and the circumstances of their marriage are established early. She became pregnant with Summer during high school and married Jerry because he was safe and present and unlikely to leave her, qualities that mattered specifically because her father had already demonstrated an ability to disappear from her life without warning. The show makes the connection explicit. Beth didn't choose Jerry because he was her great love. She chose him because he represented the opposite of Rick. And then she spent years frustrated that he wasn't more like Rick. Fact 59. The episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez contains one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the entire show. During alien couples counseling, Beth and Jerry are asked to create mental constructs representing their ideal versions of each other. Beth's idealized Jerry is a massive, dominating, godlike figure who worships her completely. Jerry's idealized Beth is a small, compliant, adoring presence who hangs on his every word. These constructs tell you everything you need to know about the specific dysfunction of their marriage. Jerry wants to be needed. Beth wants to be adored by someone she can look up to. Neither of them has found that in each other, and neither of them can say it directly. Fact 60. Jerry Smith is voiced by Chris Parnell, best known to many audiences as a cast member and writer on Saturday Night Live, and for his role in Archer. Parnell has described Jerry's particular voice quality as something he arrived at naturally when considering what a man who is constantly on the verge of defensive justification sounds like. Now, there is a slightly upward lilt to many of Jerry's declarations, as if he is always half expecting to be interrupted and proven wrong. It is a remarkably precise vocal characterization. Fact 61. Jerry has demonstrated, across the run of the show, a quiet but real resilience that frequently goes unacknowledged by the other characters. He survived on an alien planet, essentially alone through a combination of accidental competence and stubborn determination. He has gotten Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, kicked out of his own family home by simply refusing to back down at the right moment. In the episode where Jerry gets alien couples counseling, he identifies something true about the power dynamic in his marriage and uses it to his advantage. He is not as ineffective as the show or the other characters. Most of the time encourages you to believe. Fact 62. Summer Smith's character development across the series represents one of the show's most gradual and carefully constructed arcs. She begins as a teenager worried primarily about social standing and gradually evolves into one of the most capable members of the family unit when actual crises arrive. Her progression isn't framed as her discovering hidden depths. It's framed as her responding to circumstances that force her to develop capabilities she always had, beginning with the moment she inserts herself into adventures she was never invited on. Fact 63. One of the most emotionally precise moments in Summer's storyline comes from a revelation about the circumstances of her birth. She discovers that she was an unplanned pregnancy and that at one point, which Beth and Jerry had seriously considered not continuing the pregnancy. This knowledge hits Summer hard precisely because it confirms a fear she has carried without articulating, that she was optional, that the family would have continued existing without her. The show uses this to contextualize all of her need for recognition and belonging. She's not just a teenager who wants to be popular. She is a person who has always been afraid that her presence in the world was not quite necessary. Fact 64. The show hinted across multiple seasons that Beth may have been a genuinely disturbing child. Rick built her elaborate toys as a child that were essentially weapons. There are references to childhood incidents that remain deliberately vague but suggest Beth may have harmed other children at some point. The show plays with the idea that she has inherited Rick's more dangerous qualities and has spent her adult life managing them beneath the surface of normal suburban life. When the show eventually offered Beth a clone of herself and the chance to leave, it wasn't just a question about freedom. It was a question about which version of herself she would choose to be. Fact 65. The Space Beth storyline, in which a clone of Beth goes on adventures across the universe while the original Beth remains at home, eventually revealed something the show handled with characteristic ambiguity. By the time the two Beths reunite, neither of them knows which one is the original, because Rick deliberately set it up that way. Yet he erased the memory of who chose to leave, so that neither version would have to live with the burden of having made the lesser choice. It is one of Rick's most genuinely tender gestures, disguised as a practical solution to an awkward problem. Fact 66. Jerry's relationship with the version of Rick known as Doofus Rick, who appeared in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, is one of the show's most unexpectedly sweet background details. Doofus Rick is the only version of Rick from across the entire multiverse who genuinely enjoys Jerry's company and treats him with warmth and respect. The two bond during the episode in a way that clearly means a great deal to Jerry. In a later season episode, if viewers pay close attention to Rick's garage, a framed photograph of Doofus Rick can be spotted among the background items. Now, Jerry kept it. He just didn't want anyone to see. Fact 67. Beth's voice actress Sarah Chalk has discussed how she approaches playing a character whose intelligence and potential are in constant tension with the life she actually leads. Chalk has noted that Beth's specific flavor of sadness, the kind that comes from choosing safety over ambition and then resenting the choice, required her to find a very particular emotional frequency that was neither cartoonishly miserable nor numbly functional. Beth exists in the precise middle, and keeping her there required consistent attention to what the writers were asking the character to process in any given episode. Fact 68. The Smith family house has visible damage from various adventures across the series that the show tracks in the background. Cracks in walls from previous incidents. It changed structural elements from episodes where things went very wrong. The continuity of physical damage to the house is one of the show's quieter acts of craft, rewarding viewers who pause and look carefully at backgrounds across multiple seasons. The house accumulates its history visually the same way the characters accumulate theirs emotionally. Fact 69. Jerry was fired from his job at an advertising agency early in the series and spent several seasons either unemployed or working at positions significantly below what his education would suggest he should be capable of. The show uses his professional failures partly for comedy and partly as a consistent reminder that the world the show inhabits, even its most ordinary corners, is not particularly generous to people who don't have something impressive to offer. Jerry's professional life is the show's most direct commentary on how a society values people. Fact 70. The Smith family was shown at one point living in a Jerry daycare while Rick took Morty on adventures. The daycare is a facility that exists specifically to house and occupy Jerrys from across the multiverse while their Ricks are busy. The existence of such a facility tells you an enormous amount about the citadel of Ricks, the multiverse, and the status assigned to Jerry as a category of person. There is enough demand for Jerry management across infinite dimensions that someone built infrastructure specifically to address it. Fact 71. Beth and Rick's reconciliation scenes across the series are consistently among the most emotionally loaded moments in the show, partly because neither of them is good at the direct expression of feeling. Their scenes together often involve doing something practical or scientific together as a proxy for the conversation they cannot quite have. The show understands that the specific language of emotional unavailability is doing instead of saying, and it uses that understanding to make their scenes feel true in a way that purely verbal declarations of feeling would not. Fact 72. Summer's relationship with Rick slowly evolves from exclusion to something approaching genuine mutual respect. Rick's early reasons for not taking Summer on adventures were partly practical, related to the brainwave explanation, and partly relational, because he had a specific dynamic already established with Morty. But as the series continues, Summer proves herself repeatedly in situations that Rick didn't expect her to be able to handle. As the show rewards her persistence not with a speech about how she was right to push her way in, but simply by having Rick gradually treat her like someone whose presence he's no longer surprised by. Fact 73. Jerry's most competent moment in the entire series, by some evaluations, occurs in the climactic fight with Rick Prime during Season 6. Jerry, of all people, cuts Rick Prime's throat during a confrontation. Rick Prime is one of the most dangerous beings in the multiverse, and he did not take Jerry seriously enough to protect against him. Jerry's victory was not the result of planning or heroism. It was the result of Rick Prime's arrogance creating a blind spot, which is either a joke at Jerry's expense or genuine evidence of his hidden potential, depending on how generously you choose to read it. Fact 74. The show has, and across its run, genuinely surprised audiences with moments that reframe characters they thought they understood. Beth's complexity is one. Jerry's resilience is another. Summer's capability is a third. The Smith household is designed to look like a collection of stock family sitcom characters who, on examination, contain enough psychological specificity to sustain years of increasingly sophisticated storytelling. None of them are who they appear to be on first impression. That is the secret the house is keeping. Section 5. The Multiverse, the Citadel, and the Architecture of Infinite Selves. Facts. 75 to 93. One of the most philosophically rich things Rick and Morty does is take the concept of the multiverse, which often functions in science fiction as simply a device for plot flexibility, and use it to ask genuine questions about identity, our choice, and the relationship between who we are and what has happened to us. Fact 75. The multiverse in Rick and Morty operates on a principle of infinite divergence. Every possible decision, every possible outcome produces another branching universe where the alternative happened. This means that somewhere in the multiverse there is a dimension where Rick chose to accept Rick Prime's offer and abandoned his family. There is one where the bomb missed. There is one where Diane and Beth survived, and Rick never became what he became. The show occasionally brushes against the emotional implications of this and then moves on, letting the weight of it settle in the viewer's mind. Fact 76. The Citadel of Ricks is a massive interdimensional space station housing thousands of Ricks and their corresponding Mortys from across the multiverse. But it functions as its own society with distinct classes, political structures, economic hierarchies, and social norms. The Citadel episodes are among the most ambitious storytelling the show attempts, essentially pivoting away from the main cast to tell stories about a whole civilization, built on the premise of genius being a shared identity. Fact 77. The inequality within the Citadel mirrors real-world systems with a deliberate precision. There are wealthy Ricks in positions of power who exploit the labor of working-class Ricks and treat Mortis as second-class citizens. There are Morty schools that explicitly train Mortys to be effective sidekicks rather than independent thinkers. The show does not make this a background detail. It puts the camera directly on the oppressive structures of the Citadel and follows characters who live under them with the same attention it gives to the main cast. Fact 78. The Council of Ricks was the original governing body of the Citadel. It operated as a kind of oligarchy in which the most powerful and connected Ricks made decisions on behalf of everyone else. The show introduced the Council as an antagonistic bureaucracy in Season 1 and dismantled it progressively across subsequent seasons, with Evil Morty ultimately destroying the Citadel itself as part of his escape through the central finite curve. The rise and fall of the Council mirrors the kind of institutional arc that political science might describe as the corruption and collapse of a ruling class that confused its own dominance for legitimacy. Fact 79. Rick C-137 is regarded with particular wariness by other Ricks across the Citadel, who refer to him as a terror Rick. This designation reflects his history of hunting and killing other versions of himself during his decades-long search for Rick Prime. He is the Rick who did not follow the rules, did not integrate into the Citadel's social structure, and demonstrated a willingness to harm other Ricks that most versions of the character found incomprehensible. Even among a civilization of geniuses, C-137 is distinctively dangerous. Fact 80. The show revealed in later seasons that the existence of the Citadel itself was partly an outgrowth of Rick C-137's actions. During his long campaign against Rick Prime, he met other Ricks and eventually helped establish the Citadel and build the central finite curve. He later came to resent both of these things. The infrastructure he helped create became a cage for every dimension it enclosed, and the civilization he helped found became exactly the kind of oppressive system he might have fought against in a different context. Fact 81. The interdimensional cable episodes in Seasons 1 and 2, in which Rick and Morty watch television from other dimensions, are almost entirely improvised. Justin Roiland went into the recording booth with only loose descriptions of what was supposed to happen in each fake show and invented the dialogue on the spot. The resulting segments have an intentionally loose and awkward energy that the show frames as characteristic of television from alternate universes, but which is really just the texture of pure improvisation. You can hear the voice actor laughing during some takes. Fact 82. Evil Morty's election as president of the Citadel was accomplished partly through genuine political organizing and partly through the exploitation of Mortis' collective resentment of their position within the system. His campaign connected with a population that had never before had someone speak directly to their experience of being treated as accessories rather than people. The fact that Evil Morty was manipulating that resentment rather than genuinely representing it is the show's commentary on political demagoguery. The most effective populists are not necessarily the most sincere. Fact 83. The Omega device, the weapon that Rick Prime used to erase Diane from every dimension, operates on a principle so extreme that it makes conventional weapons seem almost trivial by comparison. It doesn't just kill a target, it removes them retroactively from existence, including from the memories of people who knew them. This means that Rick C-137's grief over Diane exists across a landscape where most evidence of Diane herself has been systematically erased. He is mourning someone who, by the rules of the device, barely seems to have existed. Fact 84. The dimension the show follows in its early seasons was initially identified as dimension C-137 by default, since that is the dimension Rick identified as his own. This was corrected in the later seasons. C-137 is Rick's original home dimension, which no longer had a Morty or Summer because Rick Prime killed Beth and Diane before they could be born. The dimension in which the show actually takes place, the Cronenberg dimension, is where Rick Prime originally came from and where he had abandoned his own Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty. When the show ends the Cronenberg dimension's active role in the narrative, it becomes clearer that the entire Smith family the audience has been watching are Rick Prime's abandoned family, adopted by the Rick who came to replace him. Fact 85. The Galactic Federation is another major institution in the show's universe, operating as a vast interstellar government that has historically been at odds with Rick C-137. The Federation is presented as bureaucratic and self-serving, with significant power over planetary populations, including the ability to chemically suppress the ambitions and minds of entire civilizations it encounters. And its relationship with Rick is complicated by the fact that Rick helped dismantle the Federation from the inside in the Season 3 premiere, which is one of the show's most impressive displays of his intelligence used in a focused and devastatingly effective way. Fact 86. The Gazorpazorpians, the extremely warlike alien species whose society is built around reproducing with captured humans, appear in an episode that manages to pack a considerable amount of commentary about gender dynamics and social structure into what is, on its surface, a story about a violent alien civilization and the child they accidentally leave with Morty. The episode Summer Sucks, which deals with a different alien civilization that has outlawed summer, and ends it with a musical number, and is the show at its most committed to burying serious thematic content inside the loudest possible comedic packaging. Fact 87. The planet Blips and Chits, which houses a massive arcade complex Rick visits in multiple episodes, contains games that the show uses to explore ideas about accomplishment, addiction, and the nature of achievement in a universe where Rick can obtain essentially anything. Rick's engagement with Blips and Chits is always framed as compulsive rather than joyful, hinting that even his leisure activities are driven by the same restless energy that makes him incapable of sitting with himself. Fact 88. One of the more disturbing implications of the multiverse as the show presents it is that all versions of Morty, Beth, Summer, and Jerry across infinite dimensions are living inside a universe engineered to keep Rick on top. The central finite curve didn't just wall off the dimensions where Rick is smart. It walled off the dimensions where every other person's life is shaped by Rick's dominance. Every relationship, every opportunity, every system inside the curve exists inside the gravitational field of Rick's genius. This is what evil Morty rejected. Not just the Citadel, the entire structural reality. Fact 89. The show has occasionally visited dimensions where the standard rules of who is powerful and who is marginalized are reversed or altered. These visits are never quite played for simple comedy. They always carry an undercurrent of discomfort, as the audience is forced to recognize how much of the show's moral landscape depends on a specific power arrangement that the main characters benefit from. Fact 90. One of the most beloved minor characters in the Citadel-adjacent storyline is Simple Rick, who appears in a commercial for a cookie brand within the Citadel. The commercial reveals that Simple Rick is a Rick who chose family contentment over achievement and is now kept in a facility where his pure, simple happiness is harvested and infused into the cookies. Other Ricks consume this happiness as a commodity because they are incapable of accessing it directly. It is one of the show's most quietly devastating jokes, disguised as advertising. Fact 91. The show's approach to the multiverse includes a detail that many viewers miss on first watch. When Rick and Morty escape the Cronenberg disaster in Season 1 by traveling to a dimension where identical versions of themselves recently died and taking their places, they are effectively abandoning their original family and world. The version of Beth, Jerry, and Summer at the end of that episode are not their original family. They are the grieving family of two people who just died. Rick and Morty walked into that grief and pretended to be the people who didn't come back. The show has never fully resolved what this means for the authenticity of the relationships that follow. Fact 92. Mr. Meeseeks, one of the show's most beloved supporting concept characters, draws thematic inspiration from Scud the Disposable Assassin, a comic book series that Dan Harmon was familiar with. The comic features a robotic assassin who, like a Meeseeks, is designed for a single purpose, and faces existential complications when that purpose is complicated. The connection between the two was confirmed by the show's creators, and Rob Schrab, who wrote Scud, had also worked with Harmon on Community, creating a direct link between the inspiration and its animated descendant. Fact 93. The show's depiction of the multiverse is philosophically closest to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which holds that every possible outcome of every quantum event produces a branching universe in which it actually occurred. This isn't the show claiming to be rigorous science. It's the show choosing a real theoretical framework as its organizing metaphor for a story about identity, choice, and grief. The choice of that specific framework rather than, say, parallel timelines accessed through time travel is not accidental. Many worlds implies infinite versions of yourself existing without your knowledge, which is a more disturbing premise than time travel and serves the show's emotional purposes better. Section 6. The mythology of secondary characters. Facts 94 to 111. The universe of Rick and Morty extends well beyond its central family. The supporting cast, even characters who appear for a single episode, tend to be constructed with enough specificity that they feel like they come from somewhere, like there is more of them than the camera shows. Fact 94. Bird Person's real name in the show's universe is Bird Person. This is not a nickname or an alias. He uses it in every context, formal or informal. The show plays with the observation that Rick's friend's name is literally Bird Person, without ever drawing excessive attention to how strange this is. His name is just his name. Fact 95. The character of Tammy, who appears as Summer's friend in the early seasons before being revealed as a Galactic Federation agent in the Season 2 finale, was specifically designed to seem like an ordinary and slightly irritating human teenager for as long as possible. The reveal that she was undercover, that her entire friendship with Summer was a constructed identity, and that she had been using her relationship with Bird Person as an intelligence operation, recontextualizes every scene she had previously appeared in. On rewatch, her behavior throughout the series takes on a completely different texture. Fact 96, Mr. But Poopy Butthole is one of the show's most unusual recurring characters, partly because the show itself treats his existence as a matter of genuine uncertainty during his first appearance. He is introduced as someone the Smith family has always known and loved, embedded in a web of happy memories that feel completely real. The parasite episode uses this to make Beth shoot him under the assumption that he must be a parasite because no one with only positive memories could be real. The reveal that he was real all along is one of the show's most effective character twists, both comedic and genuinely touching in a way that creeps up on you. Fact 97. Mr. Poopy Butthole's post-credits scenes across multiple seasons are among the most quietly devastating sequences the show produces. After being shot, he goes through physical therapy. Then he reappears in subsequent seasons, visibly aged, in different circumstances, with a cane and the clear marks of a changed life. The show uses him to ask a question that the main narrative can't always ask directly. What does it cost, in real human terms, to be in proximity to the chaos these characters generate? His answer is that it costs you years and stability and something you can never quite get back. Fact 98. Scary Terry, the Freddy Krueger parody who appears in the Season 1 episode Lawnmower Dog, became one of the most beloved one-episode characters in the show's run for a specific reason. Everything about him suggests he should be a simple comedic caricature. He is loud, aggressive, and ends every sentence with an expletive. But the episode enters his dreams and reveals a deeply insecure person who is terrified of not being scary enough. His anxiety dreams involve standing in a classroom in his underwear while students laugh at him, unable to perform the one thing that gives him identity. Rick and Morty choose to help him rather than exploit his vulnerability, and in return he helps them. The aggression was the costume. Underneath it was someone just trying to feel like enough. Fact 99. The Vindicators, the superhero team that Rick and Morty encounter in the season, 3-episode Vindicators 3: The Return of World Ender, are a direct parody of the Avengers and similar ensemble hero groups. The episode systematically deconstructs the mythology of superhero teams by revealing that the Vindicators are hypocrites, deeply flawed individuals using heroic branding to hide their dysfunction. Rick, for all his faults, sees through this immediately and spends the episode exposing it. The twist that Rick himself had set up the entire death trap while blackout drunk adds a layer of self-implication that keeps the episode from being simple criticism of others. Fact 100. Jessica's character evolved across the series from a one-dimensional crush figure to something more fully realized. The show eventually gave her a storyline in which an encounter with a time crystal fundamentally alters her perception of reality, and she returns with a serene, prophetic quality that suggests she has seen something vast and incomprehensible. The implication is that her proximity to Morty's world has changed her in ways that are parallel to how Morty's proximity to Rick has changed him. The ordinary human closest to the chaos absorbs some of it. Fact 101. Squanchy, Rick's hyperactive and reckless cat-like companion, named his own virtual reality gaming studio Squanchtendo, a portmanteau of his name and Nintendo. This is actually a real thing that Justin Roiland did. The studio he founded for virtual reality gaming was originally named Squanchtendo before being renamed Squanch Games. The naming of the studio after a character from the show is one of the more unusual instances of creator identity bleeding into a real-world business decision. Fact 102. King Jellybean. Now, the jolly, monarchical Jellybean figure who appears in the Me Seeks and Destroy episode and attempts to assault Morty in a bathroom had a prior life in Justin Roiland's creative work before Rick and Morty. A character resembling King Jellybean appeared in an earlier Roiland production called Unbelievable Tales, where he was known as Crumply Crumplistian and was described as even weirder than his Rick and Morty counterpart. The show's decision to give the character a seemingly heroic reputation within his own kingdom, before revealing his predatory behavior off-screen, is one of its more disturbing narrative choices. Fact 103. Unity, the hive mind entity that Rick has a romantic relationship with, in the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation, is one of the most thematically interesting characters the show ever created. That she is simultaneously a being of enormous power and someone who is fundamentally shaped by Rick's influence. When Unity decides to leave Rick at the end of the episode, it is because she recognizes that her relationship with him causes her to make worse decisions, to indulge in things she knows are wrong, because Rick normalizes them. Her departure is one of the most adult and emotionally precise moments the show contains. Fact 104. When Rick asks Unity to entertain him by creating a television show, she produces an alien version of the Community Study Group sitting around a table. This is one of several explicit references to Community that the show makes across its run, reflecting Dan Harmon's obvious affection for his previous project. The show also contains a character who is an alien version of Jeff Winger at one point, and various other nods to the Community universe that reward fans who follow both shows. Fact 105. The concept of Aberdolf Linkler, a genetically engineered combination of Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln that Rick created to produce the perfect morally neutral person, is one of the show's most absurdist scientific premises. The character exists in genuine psychological torment, unable to commit to good or evil, pulled in opposite directions by the competing ethical frameworks of two of history's most dramatically different leaders. His eventual resolution, if it can be called that, comes in the second season when he sacrifices himself in a moment of genuine heroism, suggesting that the Lincoln genetics won a final, conclusive argument with the Hitler genetics at the last possible moment. Fact 106. The Galactic Federation's method of controlling planets? It involves deploying a chemical into planetary water supplies that suppresses ambition and creativity in the general population, making them docile and economically exploitable. When Rick dismantles this system during the Season 3 premiere, he is not just freeing Earth from Federation occupation. He is restoring the ability of an entire civilization to want things, to strive, to be dissatisfied. There is an argument to be made that this is the most unambiguously good thing Rick does in the entire series. Fact 107. Morty Smith Jr., the rapidly maturing offspring of Morty and a Gazorpazorpian sex robot, appears in a single episode and is ultimately revealed to have chosen a career as a spoken-word artist making deeply angry and aggressive art about his absent parents. Thus, the episode handles Morty's relationship with his accidental son with more emotional honesty than many shows would commit to in a single episode. Morty loves his son but cannot be the parent his son needs. The resolution is painful but feels honest. Fact 108. The recurring interdimensional bureaucrat Blim Blam, who appears primarily in the episode where Rick and Morty accidentally free him while trying to cure his heart condition, is one of the show's examples of a character who is technically a villain, but whose villainy is contextually complicated. He is introduced as someone in genuine distress, is treated as a patient, and then turns out to be a murderous alien who kills for pleasure. The show uses him to examine the limits of compassion, specifically the question of whether compassion that ends badly was still the right impulse. Fact 109. The character referred to as Mr. Nimbus, who appears as Rick's nemesis in the Season 5 premiere, was described as a character Rick and Dan Harmon had always wanted to put in the show, but kept not having the right moment for. He is an Aquaman parody with an exaggerated musculature and authority over the police of the sea. And his relationship with Rick has a long and apparently extremely complicated history that the show deliberately does not fully explain. His ability to control police is a joke that runs through his appearances, always stated with absolute gravity. Fact 110. Planetina, the environmentally conscious superhero who becomes Morty's girlfriend in a Season 5 episode, begins as a clear parody of Captain Planet, but is developed with enough specificity that her eventual fate feels genuinely affecting, rather than comedic. The episode ends with Morty having to choose between his relationship with Planetina and his family's safety, and the choice he makes, while correct, costs him something real. The show allows him to feel that cost without immediately resolving it. Fact 111. The show's roster of alien creatures and civilizations draws from an enormous range of science fiction literature and film. Silent but obvious references appear to the xenomorphs from the Alien franchise, creatures from the District 9 universe, designs echoing the work of H.R. Giger, and dozens of other science fiction properties. The alien character designs are done in a house style that is consistent enough to feel like a unified aesthetic while varied enough to suggest genuine biological diversity. The show's creature designers have described the challenge as creating beings that look like they evolved naturally rather than being designed, even though they are very much being designed. Section 7. Easter eggs, hidden details, and the show's secret language facts 112 to 130. One of the defining pleasures of watching Rick and Morty carefully, rather than just quickly, is discovering the layer of conversation the show is having with itself and with other media beneath the surface of what it shows you. The writers and animators clearly derive enormous pleasure from hiding things. Fact 112. In the Season 1 episode Total Rickle, in which parasitic aliens infiltrate the Smith house by implanting false memories, the episode that immediately precedes it in broadcast order provides the explanation for how the parasites got in. At the end of Morty Night Run, Rick shovels alien rocks into his spaceship. If you pause and look carefully at the rocks, pink eggs can be seen attached to them. Those eggs are the same parasites that appear in the following episode. The infection was already beginning when the previous story ended. Fact 113. During the scene in the pilot episode where Rick and Morty pass through interdimensional customs, the frame is packed with alien silhouettes. Among them, sharp-eyed viewers can spot the shapes of characters from Mystery Science Theater 3000, specifically Tom Servo, Crow T. Robot, and Gypsy. As a silhouette resembling an alien from the Space Invaders arcade game can also be spotted in the corner. It is a Waldo-style visual puzzle that takes only a fraction of a second of screen time. Fact 114. In the Citadel scenes in the Season 3 episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which follows various Ricks and Mortys living their lives within the Citadel rather than following the main cast, a Rick in a distinctive coat and scarf that unmistakably resembles the outfit of the Fourth Doctor from Doctor Who can be spotted moving through the crowd. It appears for approximately 1 second. Fact 115. Justin Roiland and Alex Hirsch, the creator of Gravity Falls, are close friends, and had planned a crossover between the two universes. This crossover never fully materialized, but the show contains multiple nods to it. Yes, in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, when various items fall out of portals, one of them is a notebook with a question mark on it, identical to the journal that is a central artifact in Gravity Falls. Grunkle Stan's hat and coat also tumble through. In the Citadel crowds, Morty versions of Gravity Falls characters Dipper and Mabel can be spotted. Fact 116. Rick's garage contains a box explicitly labeled time travel stuff that the show's writers have confirmed is a deliberate in-joke about their dislike of time travel as a narrative device. The box sits visible on a shelf in multiple episodes. Time travel is essentially never used as a plot mechanism in the show. The box represents every time travel idea that was pitched and placed permanently on the shelf. Fact 117. In Rick's bedroom, briefly visible in the closing moments of the close Rick counters of the Rick Kind episode, there is a bulletin board covered in strings and photographs that constitute Rick's research and tracking system for Rick Prime. The board shows images of Mr. Meeseeks, Cronenberg monsters, Prince Nebulon from the Anatomy Park episode, and other figures from the show's history. Most remarkably, the board also includes an image of Aberdolf Linkler from the very next episode, meaning Rick's conspiracy board appears to already contain knowledge of a character who hadn't appeared in the show's narrative yet. Fact 118. The dead flies that Summer finds scattered across Rick's garage in the Season 3 premiere do not appear to be random. When Rick subtly realigns them, they trigger a mechanism that causes the garage floor to split and reveal a hidden laboratory. The flies are not decorative or incidental. They are a security system. You could walk through that garage 1,000 times and not notice that the specific arrangement of dead insects on the floor is the key to a secret room. Fact 119. Dan Harmon's harmonious claptrap vanity card has now changed it multiple times to reflect different periods of his personal life. It started as a warm domestic scene with Harmon and his wife. It became a lonely, slightly chaotic image after his divorce. It changed again when he entered a new relationship. The card is effectively a personal documentary running in the closing seconds of every episode, embedding Harmon's actual life into the fabric of the show. Fact 120. In the episode Morty's Mind Blowers, and if viewers play the Truth Tortoise scene backward, there is reportedly a hidden audio message. The claim about this message connects it to the Beatles, specifically echoing the infamous backward masking theories about Beatles records that were popular in the 1960s and 1970s. Whether the show is genuinely hiding something backward in the audio, or making a meta-joke about the culture of finding hidden messages in media is itself ambiguous. Fact 121. The episode Rick Potion number 9, in which Morty's attempt to make Jessica love him goes catastrophically wrong and mutates most of humanity, is notable for two things beyond its main plot. First, it contains one of the most tonally abrupt endings in animation, in which Rick and Morty literally bury themselves in the backyard of a different dimension while upbeat music plays. Second, the episode quietly sets up the entire existential premise of the rest of the series, establishing that Rick and Morty are now living in a dimension that is not their own, with a family that experienced the grief of losing them. Fact 122. The show has a recurring visual joke about Jerry and his car. Across multiple episodes, Jerry's car is shown to be the most ordinary and boring vehicle imaginable, while Rick's ship is an elaborately capable technological wonder. The contrast between the two forms of transportation serves as a consistent visual shorthand for the contrast between Jerry's ordinary life and the world Rick inhabits. At one point, Rick's car is seen protecting Summer with a degree of lethal force that the episode's writers compared explicitly to the protective rage of a parent. Fact 123. Rick Potion number 9's title is a reference to the 1959 pop song Love Potion number 9, recorded by the Clovers and later covered by the Searchers. The show consistently names episodes with pun titles that layer meaning. Anatomy Park is a Jurassic Park reference. Lawnmower Dog begins as a Lassie parody before becoming a Nightmare on Elm Street parody, before becoming something stranger. Look Who's Purging Now is a reference to both the Look Who's Talking film series and the Purge franchise. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind combines Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Rick's name. The naming conventions are themselves a form of hidden communication with audiences who know the references. Fact 124. Rick's portal gun fluid is a finite resource that requires replenishment. The show has occasionally used the depletion of portal fluid as a genuine plot constraint. But the composition of the fluid is one of the show's most carefully protected secrets, revealed only in passing and contradicted at various points. The most widely referenced suggestion is that it involves dark matter or some form of quantum material, but the show is deliberately inconsistent about the specifics, making it function more as a narrative device than as consistent world building. Fact 125. The episode A Wrinkle in Time, which deals with Rick, Morty, and Summer being fractured across multiple timelines after Rick pauses time for too long, contains a visual structure in which the screen is literally split to show multiple diverging probabilities simultaneously. The episode is one of the show's most formally experimental at using its visual grammar to actually demonstrate the concept it's exploring rather than simply describing it. The moment where the timelines consolidate back into one is accompanied by a choice that Morty makes that the show frames as his clearest act of pure love for Rick up to that point. Fact 126. In the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation, the final scene, in which Rick descends into his lab alone and attempts to use a device on himself before breaking down, is played entirely without dialogue over the song Do You Feel It by Chaos Chaos. It is the most openly, emotionally raw Rick has been shown to be in the entire series up to that point, and the choice to communicate it entirely through visual storytelling and music rather than words makes it one of the most affecting sequences the show has produced. Fact 127. Of the song Terryfold, which appears in the episode Rest and Ricklaxation and plays on the radio during a cab scene, was actually released as a real single on iTunes immediately after the episode aired. It was created as a collaboration between Justin Roiland and the band Chaos Chaos, the same band whose song Do You Feel It appeared in Autoerotic Assimilation. The show has a notably sophisticated relationship with its music choices, rarely using incidental music as mere background, and frequently selecting pieces that comment directly on what the characters are feeling in ways the characters themselves cannot express. Fact 128. In multiple episodes, fans have noted that Rick's spaceship appears to have some form of autonomous protective personality. It has shown itself capable of making decisions independently when Rick is incapacitated or absent. This leads to the implication that the ship may have a more complex intelligence than the show explicitly acknowledges, functioning almost like a quiet secondary character in the background of various adventures. Fact 129. The plumbus, a device that appears in an interdimensional cable segment and is presented as an item that every household in every dimension owns and uses daily, became one of the most discussed objects in the show's mythology. Its construction process is depicted in elaborate and increasingly absurd detail, involving a series of unrecognizable alien materials and steps that suggest a deeply bizarre manufacturing process. The plumbus's actual function is never revealed. It is one of the show's longest-running commitments to a mystery that has no answer. Fact 130. Rick's shirt, which is almost always the same simple white lab coat design, occasionally has small details in it that continuity-focused viewers have noticed change between episodes. Stains appear and disappear. Tears that should have been there from a previous adventure sometimes vanish. The inconsistency is partly the result of animated production realities, and partly, some fans argue, a deliberate signal that the Rick in any given episode may not be precisely the same Rick who appeared in the previous one. Section 8. Production secrets and the making of each episode. Facts 131 to 148. Behind every episode of Rick and Morty is a production process that is substantially more chaotic, laborious, and occasionally alcohol-inflected than the finished product might suggest. The show's creators have been more forthcoming than most about the messiness of how it gets made. Fact 131. Justin Roiland's recording sessions for Rick's dialogue sometimes involved actual intoxication. Dan Harmon confirmed in interviews that he occasionally encouraged Roiland to record Rick's lines while genuinely drunk, reasoning that since the character was an alcoholic, there was a kind of method logic to the approach. A behind-the-scenes video released by Adult Swim shows one of these sessions, in which Roiland struggles to remember lines, goes off script repeatedly, and at one point insists he sounds too sober and needs another drink, to which the crew collectively and firmly answers no. Fact 132. While the interdimensional cable episodes are the show's most explicitly improvised content. Royland has described going into the recording booth with only loose descriptions of what each fake television program was supposed to be, and inventing the specifics entirely in the moment. The resulting performances have a deliberately rough quality that the show frames as characteristic of television from other dimensions. The corpse-like giggling that sometimes leaks through the performance is audible in some segments, and the show doesn't bother to hide it, letting the meta-joke about the looseness of alternate universe television cover the improvisation. Fact 133. The writing process for a typical episode begins with the entire writer's room gathering to pitch and discuss ideas, pulling from personal anecdotes, science fiction concepts, and jokes that have been circulating in conversation for weeks or months. Once a story is selected, it is broken down using Harmon's story circle structure. A writer is assigned to produce an outline, which Roiland and Harmon then revise. The script goes through multiple full drafts. The final version requires approval from one of the co-creators before it goes into production. The total time from initial concept to finished episode is measured in months. Fact 134. The show uses Toon Boom Harmony as its primary animation software and Adobe Photoshop for background art. This combination is common in professional animation, but the show's specific visual style, with its slightly rough line quality and deliberately restrained color palette punctuated by vivid portal greens and alien environments, but required significant internal style development before it felt consistent. Fact 135. The gap between Season 2 and Season 3 of Rick and Morty was approximately a year and a half. During this period, Adult Swim produced a series of brief animated shorts called Non-Canonical Adventures, in which Rick, Morty, and other characters from the show reenacted famous science fiction and horror films in compressed 15 to 21-second segments. The shorts were made by British stop-motion animator Lee Hardcastle and covered a range of films including A Clockwork Orange, Halloween, and Ex Machina. Fact 136. Harmon has been open about the fact that his perfectionism creates production delays. The third season of the show was initially planned to have 14 episodes, but delivered only 10, largely because of how long the writing process took when Harmon was committed to quality over speed. The trade-off is visible in the finished product. Season 3 episodes tend to be among the most structurally precise of the show's run, with very little excess and very few narrative elements that feel underdeveloped. Fact 137. The famous Wubba Luba Dub Dub catchphrase was improvised by Roiland during recording. He has confirmed in interviews that the phrase emerged spontaneously during a take and that it was not in the script. The decision to keep it and build an in-universe explanation for it, connecting it to genuine pain through Bird Person's translation, is an example of the show's ability to take accidental elements and retroactively give them weight. Fact 138. Producer J. Michael Mendel, who worked on Rick and Morty and previously produced The Simpsons, passed away on September 22, 2019. He was credited on the show through Season 4. His death was noted by the show's writers and crew with genuine grief, and his contributions to the production's tone and quality were acknowledged as significant. Fact 139. The voice cast for the rest of the main family has remained consistent across the show's entire run, which is notable given the substantial change to the two lead voices after Roiland's departure. Chris Parnell as Jerry, Spencer Grammer as Summer, and Sarah Chalk as Beth continued through the recasting without interruption. Their continuity provided an important element of stability for an audience adjusting to new voices for the two central characters. Fact 140. The casting search for Rick and Morty's replacements after Roiland's firing lasted approximately 6 months and involved hearing thousands of candidates. Showrunner Scott Marder described the particular challenge of finding someone for Rick's voice by noting that almost every auditioner sounded like either Macho Man Randy Savage or a cousin of his, neither of which was even close to the right register. Ian Cardoni was found and cast first, which allowed the search for Harry Belden to proceed with Rick's voice already locked in. Fact 141. Harry Belden was found as Morty's voice only after the search had exhausted what Marder described as every possible resource. The timing of his discovery late in the casting process and the circumstances of his being informed, through a surprise Zoom call arranged by his agents under the pretense of a mysterious project, meant that his path to one of the most high-profile animated voice roles in recent television was notably unconventional. Fact 142. Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden were deliberately kept apart from each other throughout much of the casting and early production process, to the point where production staff made jokes about doing it on purpose just to drive them crazy. When they finally met in person, Belden described feeling like he already knew Cardoni because he had heard so much about him and eavesdropped on recordings of his lines. Fact 143. A significant and often discussed production detail is that the current voice actors for Rick and Morty do not record together in the same room. Their dialogue is captured separately and assembled in editing, with the actors performing to audio playback of each other's lines rather than in real-time reaction. Harry Belden has noted that this means the show's remarkable sense of back-and-forth naturalism between the two characters is entirely a product of performance craft, editing skill, and the quality of the writing, rather than genuine spontaneous exchange. Fact 144. Rick and Morty has won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program twice, first for the Pickle Rick episode in 2018 and again in subsequent years. The Pickle Rick win was notable both because of the episode's content, which features an animated character committing elaborate acts of cartoon violence against rats and gangsters while in the form of a pickle, and because the commentary track on the Blu-ray release of the episode was recorded by Game of Thrones creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, along with Peter Dinklage, who played Tyrion Lannister. Fact 145. The show's episode descriptions, which appear in TV listings and on streaming services, were originally written by Justin Roiland and are characterized by a very specific voice that blends promotional language with self-aware humor and occasional non-sequiturs. Following Roiland's departure, the identity of whoever writes these descriptions has not been publicly confirmed, and the voice has shifted noticeably. Fact 146. Adult Swim's relationship with Rick and Morty has been characterized by unusual levels of promotional innovation. During the gap between seasons, they deployed a mobile truck called the Rickmobile that toured across the United States, allowing fans to purchase show merchandise directly. The Rickmobile was designed to look like Rick's face. It became a cultural event in cities it visited, with fans lining up for hours to see it. Fact 147. The show has produced several companion pieces of content beyond the main series, including the Rick and Morty Bushworld Adventures special made by Australian animator Michael Cusack, which features distinctly different versions of Rick and Morty, called Rick and Morty, operating in the Australian outback with a completely different visual and tonal approach. The special was released as part of an April Fool's Day event and became its own cult item within the show's fandom. Fact 148. The show's music is overseen with significant care. The composer Ryan Elder has worked on the series since its beginning, and his contributions range from the show's immediately recognizable theme music, which balances whimsy and unease in a way that perfectly captures the show's tone, to the specific incidental cues that appear during emotional moments, and that often carry more of the scene's emotional weight than the dialogue does. Section 9. Cultural impact, the Szechuan incident, and the fandom. Facts 149 to 163. Rick and Morty is one of those rare shows that has crossed the line from television program into genuine cultural phenomenon. Its language, characters, and ideas have seeped into popular culture in ways that continue to accumulate years after its premiere. Fact 149. 100. The Szechuan sauce incident of 2017 is one of the more extraordinary examples of a television show directly affecting consumer behavior in the real world. In the Season 3 premiere, The Rickshank Rickdemption, which was dropped unexpectedly on April Fool's Day 2017, Rick delivers a monologue in which he reveals that his true motivation for the entire elaborate escape and Federation dismantling operation was not his family, not principle, not any grand ideal. It was a McDonald's dipping sauce. Specifically, the Szechuan teriyaki sauce that McDonald's had briefly offered as a promotional item, tied to the 1998 Disney film Mulan. Fact 150. The sauce had been off the market for 19 years when Rick mentioned it. Most people watching the episode had never tasted it, including almost everyone under the age of 25. So the passionate and slightly deranged intensity with which Rick described it, combined with the show's enormous audience, created something unprecedented. Fans began petitioning McDonald's to bring the sauce back, McDonald's, recognizing a marketing opportunity, sent a large jug of the sauce directly to Justin Roiland and the writer's room. The creators tried it. The verdict was positive. Fact 151. McDonald's announced that Szechuan sauce would return for a single day on October 7th, 2017. This is where things went dramatically wrong. The corporation had significantly underestimated the size and intensity of the demand. Only a handful of locations were designated to carry the sauce, and each received minimal quantities. Fans lined up at these locations by the hundreds, in some cases by the thousands. Locations ran out of sauce within minutes of opening. The resulting scenes of disappointed and occasionally furious fans went viral. There were reports of police being called to manage crowds at several locations. Fact 152. In the aftermath, McDonald's issued an apology and ultimately brought the sauce back in much larger quantities in February 2018, making 20 million cups available across locations nationwide. By this point, the cultural conversation had shifted. The original joke had been almost entirely swamped by the spectacle of the fan reaction. Dan Harmon expressed frustration that what had been a deliberately absurdist and self-aware joke about Rick's nihilism had been absorbed by a corporate promotion that didn't fully understand what it was referencing. Justin Roiland urged fans to be kind to McDonald's employees, us who were not responsible for the planning decisions. Fact 153. Individual packets of the Szechuan sauce were selling on eBay for prices ranging from $100 to several $100 at the height of the frenzy. A 3-pack sold for over $800. These were completed auctions. People paid these prices. Fact 154. The Szechuan incident became a case study in media and marketing circles about the dangers of corporations engaging with internet fandoms without genuinely understanding them. Several analyses noted that the kind of humor that made the joke funny in the first place was directly undercut by McDonald's attempt to capitalize on it. The joke was about nihilism, about Rick reducing everything he'd done to an absurd craving for a discontinued sauce, and a corporation eagerly bringing back that sauce to profit from the association missed the joke entirely. Fact 155. Pickle Rick became a cultural phenomenon almost independently of the show that produced it. The image of a pickle with Rick Sanchez's face rapidly proliferated across social media and merchandise platforms. Adult Swim had Pickle Rick merchandise available within minutes of the episode's broadcast. There was a Pringles flavor released in collaboration with the show based on the character. There was a frosty drink from Wendy's. There was a customization option added to Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. An animated pickle had become a recognizable cultural icon. Fact 156. "I'm Pickle Rick" became one of the most repeated phrases of 2017, achieving the kind of meme longevity that most viral moments do not sustain. The phrase appeared on t-shirts, in conversation, in political cartoons. It was used as a shorthand for the show generally, and occasionally as a shorthand for a certain kind of absurdist humor. The phrase eventually became, by some measures, a symbol of the fandom's more exhausting tendency toward aggressive in-joke signaling. Fact 157. The show's fan community has a complex relationship with its own reputation. The vocal and sometimes troubling behavior of a subset of fans, particularly around the Szechuan sauce incident, created a cultural narrative about Rick and Morty fans that the majority of the audience found embarrassing and inaccurate. Dan Harmon addressed this publicly more than once, expressing discomfort with fans who had interpreted Rick's nihilism as a philosophy to emulate rather than a pathology to understand. Fact 158. Pocket Mortis, the mobile game inspired by the show's concept of multiple Mortys existing across the multiverse, was released in 2016 and used the premise of collecting and training different Morty variants in a format that intentionally echoed Pokemon's gameplay structure. The game was developed with involvement from the show and includes characters, voice clips, and visual gags consistent with the series. It has been updated regularly and maintained an active player base well past the initial curiosity around its release. Fact 159. Rick and Morty has inspired serious academic analysis across disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, and cultural studies. The show's engagement with existentialism, nihilism, multiverse theory, And moral philosophy has produced a body of critical writing that treats it with the same analytical seriousness applied to prestige drama. Academics have written about its treatment of depression and trauma, its political commentary through the Citadel storyline, and its meditation on what it means to be exceptional in a universe that contains infinite versions of every possible person. Fact 160. The show has been credited by some science communicators with popularizing genuine scientific concepts, particularly around quantum mechanics and multiverse theory, to audiences who might not otherwise encounter them. While the show is not scientifically rigorous and acknowledges this freely, it uses real theoretical frameworks as the basis for its fictional premises in a way that has motivated some viewers to investigate the real science. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics saw a measurable uptick in general public awareness around the time of the show's peak popularity. Fact 161. Adult Swim's 2018 deal ordering 70 new episodes was described at the time as one of the largest and most unprecedented commitments made to an animated series in cable television history. The deal gave Harmon and the writers' room an unusual degree of security and creative freedom, knowing the show had a guaranteed future regardless of individual season reception. This security may have contributed to the writers' willingness to take larger narrative risks in subsequent seasons, including the extended and complex canon storytelling around Rick Prime and Evil Morty. Fact 162. The show has produced a genuine musical moment in the song Terryfold, which charted on some streaming platforms after its release, and demonstrates that the show's musical sensibility is sophisticated enough to produce something that can stand outside the context of the show that spawned it. The song was composed and recorded as a legitimate piece of pop music and treated accordingly in its release strategy. Fact 163. Rick and Morty's influence on adult animation is difficult to overstate. In the years following its premiere, there was a significant increase in animated series that attempted to combine mature themes, dark humor, and serialized storytelling with the kind of tonal complexity the show pioneered for the format. Shows across multiple networks showed the clear fingerprints of what Rick and Morty had proven audiences would engage with and reward. Section 10, The Darkest Corners. The strangest implications and unresolved mysteries. Facts 164 to 175. Every show that builds a complex enough universe eventually accumulates a shadow beneath its visible surface. The implications of things that are shown or said but not examined. The threads that are left hanging, the questions that the show seems to be deliberately not answering. Rick and Morty has more of these than most, and they are worth spending time with, especially in the quiet hours. Fact 164. The show has established that Rick has killed enormous numbers of other versions of himself during his hunt for Rick Prime. The moral and emotional weight of this is occasionally examined, particularly since the Ricks he kills are, at some level, people who share his intelligence, his history, and his fundamental nature. The question of how Rick lives with this is never directly answered. The show positions it as one more item in an already overwhelming ledger of grief and violence that Rick carries without examining. Fact 165. When Rick and Morty escape the Cronenberg dimension in Season 1, they take the places of their recently deceased counterparts in a new dimension. This means the Beth, Jerry, and Summer they return to have experienced genuine grief, watching Rick and Morty's caskets being lowered into the ground before Rick and Morty walk through a portal and announce themselves as back. The family in the new dimension never learns what happened. The cost of that secret is invisible because the show treats the transition as a reset. Fact 166. But Rick built an artificial intelligence shaped entirely around the voice and personality of his dead wife Diane, and installed it in his old house specifically to torment him. He then trapped the entire dimension in a time loop set to the day he lost her. He sustained this arrangement for decades. This level of self-inflicted punishment goes well beyond what the show typically acknowledges in character analysis. It suggests that whatever coping mechanism Rick presents to the world, his private relationship with Diane's death was an act of sustained and deliberate self-harm. Fact 167. The episode Morty's Mind Blowers reveals that a significant portion of Morty's memory has been erased, not just once or twice, but systematically to the point where there are memories he doesn't recognize at all and cannot access. Now, the episode provides some of the erased memories for context, and they are almost uniformly situations in which Morty's choices led to catastrophic consequences for himself or others. He has been protecting himself from his own history, and the history he's erased is extensive. Fact 168. The show includes a recurring suggestion that squirrels are more organized and purposeful than they appear, potentially operating some form of secret intelligence network. Morty encounters this implication in the Mind Blowers episode, and it results in him and Rick having to flee to yet another dimension. The squirrel conspiracy is never investigated further. It is either a running gag or the beginning of a thread the writers have not yet chosen to pull. Fact 169. Rick's Garage, which functions as the primary staging ground for most of the show's adventures, contains items and projects in various states of completion that have never been addressed in the main narrative. Some of these were identified on the conspiracy board in Rick's room during Season 1. Others appear and disappear across episodes without explanation. The garage functions as a visual archive of everything Rick has done and thought about and started and abandoned, which is itself a metaphor for the character. Fact 170. One of the most disturbing implications of the central finite curve is that it suggests there are infinite dimensions outside it where Ricks are not particularly special. In those dimensions, whoever the most capable and powerful people are, they are not Rick Sanchez. Every version of Morty and Beth and Jerry and Summer living inside the curve is living in a universe where their entire social structure and reality was designed around the assumption of Rick's supremacy. The curve creates a totalizing effect. You cannot live inside it and be fully outside Rick's influence. Fact 171. Evil Morty's escape through the central finite curve is the show's most revolutionary narrative event, but the show has been notably careful about what comes next. Evil Morty leaves. He flies through the breach. The camera watches his ship disappear into dimensions where Rick is not dominant. And then the show has not definitively shown audiences what he found there. What does exist outside the curve? What does a multiverse look like when it hasn't been architected around one person's genius? The question hangs there. It's enormous and unanswered. Fact 172. Rick C-137's relationship with the Smith family is genuinely complicated by the fact that they are not his original family in any meaningful biological sense. He came to them as a replacement for Rick Prime, the actual grandfather, who had abandoned them. He stayed because he found himself loving them despite everything. But the show never fully resolves what this means for how Rick experiences that love. Is he loving Beth or the shadow of the daughter he lost? Is he loving Morty because Morty is genuinely remarkable to him? Or because Morty fills the space that his own Beth and Diane would have filled? The show poses these questions through the relationships themselves without providing explicit answers. Fact 173. The show has suggested multiple times that the version of Rick audiences follow may not be quite as morally superior to Rick Prime as the narrative framing encourages you to feel. Rick C-137 has caused enormous collateral damage throughout his life. He has abandoned people, manipulated them, used them as tools, and left behind wreckage across dozens of dimensions in the course of his adventures. The difference between him and Rick Prime is that C-137's selfishness is tangled up with genuine affection, and that he retained the capacity to love. Whether that makes him better or simply more complicated is something the show consistently refuses to settle. Fact 174. The question of what Rick would have become if Diane and Beth had not been killed is one the show tantalizes with but never answers. The Rickest Rick, as other characters sometimes describe C-137, is the Rick whose tragedy shaped him into something beyond what he would have naturally been. His competence and his damage are the same event. Without the tragedy, he might have been a brilliant but ordinary man who loved his family and never invented portal travel. The version that exists in the show is what grief and rage and a century of interdimensional violence created. It is not clear whether that version is better or worse than the one who never had to be made. Fact 175. The show's title promises you Rick and Morty, 2 names, 2 characters, 1 relationship. But across its run, the show has consistently revealed that the relationship is more than its description suggests. It is a grandfather who didn't choose this family and chose to stay anyway. Like, it is a grandson who was never supposed to have this grandfather and who has been shaped by him in ways that are sometimes enriching and sometimes devastating. It is two people from different dimensions who are not technically related, living in a universe that was not designed for either of them, finding in each other something they didn't know they needed. Whether the show calls that love or habit or mutual survival, the texture of what they have, when you look at it closely over hundreds of episodes, is something that most characters in fiction never get close to. A relationship that is completely specific to both of them and completely impossible to replace. Before we close completely, there are a handful of additional small facts that didn't fit neatly into any single section, but deserve to be said out loud before we're done. Much of the show has been translated and broadcast in dozens of countries and languages. In some regions, the translation process produced genuinely interesting shifts in the humor, as jokes that rely on specific English phrasing or American cultural references had to be re-engineered for audiences who would not otherwise recognize them. The Japanese anime adaptation released in 2024 approached the material through a fundamentally different visual and tonal language, producing something that is both recognizably Rick and Morty and distinctly its own thing. Rick's character has drawn consistent comparisons to the archetype of the trickster figure in mythology, a character type found across dozens of global traditions, who is simultaneously a creator and a destroyer, a helper and a threat, an agent of change who operates outside the normal rules. But what makes Rick a sophisticated version of this archetype is that the show is aware he is playing this role, and occasionally catches him in moments of genuine vulnerability that the classic trickster figure is not typically allowed to have. The show once produced an episode that was entirely a parody of a heist film called One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, which is itself a layered title riffing on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The episode is a heist story about someone who is so good at heist stories that they have become unable to experience genuine surprise, and whose solution to this problem is to engineer increasingly elaborate heists to try to recapture the sensation. The episode is, among other things, a direct commentary on the show's own relationship with its audience, who have become sophisticated enough to anticipate its moves. The meta level of the joke is that the episode is also a heist, that the show itself is pulling on the viewer's expectations. The character of Planetina, as mentioned earlier, contains an underexamined detail. She is explicitly described as the result of 4 children, summoning an elemental being the same way that Captain Planet was summoned by the Planeteers. The implication is that she has been continuously summoned and unsummoned throughout her entire existence, that she has no continuous experience of being alive in the way that most beings do. She has been called into existence repeatedly for the purpose of fighting environmental destruction, and then returned to wherever she comes from again and again for what may be decades. While the emotional implications of that existence are something the episode gestures toward without fully dwelling on. The episode in which Rick reveals that his entire apparent emotional backstory in the Season 3 premiere was claimed to be fabricated is one of the show's most carefully constructed moments of unreliable narration. Rick tells the Galactic Federation agent that the memory they scanned was a fake he prepared to deliver a virus. But the later seasons confirm that the memory was almost entirely true. This means the episode contains a layer in which the most painful and vulnerable thing Rick has ever expressed in front of another character was immediately followed by him denying that any of it was real. The vulnerability happened. He simply could not let anyone know that it did. Rick's relationship with money and material resources is fascinatingly inconsistent. He can build technologies that entire civilizations would spend millennia trying to replicate, and yet the Smith household operates on what appears to be a fairly ordinary middle-class budget, supplemented occasionally by the results of whatever adventures Rick has been on. The show has explored the question of why Rick doesn't simply accumulate unlimited resources given his capabilities, and the most honest answer the show provides is that Rick doesn't particularly want things. He wants experiences, connections, challenges. None of those require money in a multiverse where you can manufacture essentially anything. Finally, the show's treatment of consciousness and personal identity is one of its most quietly radical elements. When Rick and Morty move between dimensions, the question of whether they are the same people becomes genuinely complicated. When Rick body snatches his way through multiple hosts in the season 3 premiere, the show tracks the question of identity through each transition. When the Diane AI can hold the kind of conversation with Rick that the real Diane might have held, the show asks whether the distinction between authentic and constructed consciousness is as clear as we assume it is. These are real philosophical questions, and the show engages with them not as puzzle boxes to be solved, but as ongoing sources of discomfort to be lived with. That is 175 facts, mysteries, and quiet revelations about a show that has been hiding things in plain sight since its very first episode. Every time you watch it again, you'll notice something new. A detail that wasn't visible the first time, a foreshadowing that was already there, a background character doing something in a corner of the frame that only makes sense if you already know what comes later. The universe of Rick and Morty is built on the premise that everything is connected, that the chaos has a structure if you're patient enough to look for it, and that underneath the loudest and most outrageous surface you can imagine, there's always something more honest and more sad and more beautiful going on. If this video helped you find some of that underneath, then it did what it was supposed to do. If you enjoyed the journey through this universe tonight, please consider leaving a like. It's the simplest thing you can do to help this channel keep making these long, quiet, detail-rich videos. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good time. Every subscriber is a direct signal that this kind of content is worth making, and this channel only exists because of people who care enough to stay. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Sleep well. Cue Pickle Rick. History told the quiet way. Final thoughts on watching a show that watches you back. There is something that experienced Rick and Morty viewers notice, usually sometime in their second or third complete rewatch of the series. The show changes depending on what you know, not just in the obvious sense that jokes land differently once you understand the references, but in a deeper sense. The emotional register of scenes shifts. Things that seemed like pure comedy acquire a melancholy undertone. Things that seemed heavy reveal moments of genuine warmth underneath them. Characters you initially read as simple reveal themselves to be considerably more complicated. This is true of very few television shows. Most shows reward rewatch with the pleasure of familiarity, of already knowing how things turn out. Rick and Morty rewards rewatch with the sensation of understanding more. Every time you know more about the characters, the same scenes become different scenes. The pilot episode, watched after understanding Rick's full backstory, is almost an entirely different emotional experience from watching it without that knowledge. Rick dragging Morty out of bed in the middle of the night to tell him he built a bomb that will destroy the world reads differently when you understand that this is a man who has already survived the destruction of his own world once through Rick Prime's bomb and once through his own grief. The show has been doing this from the beginning. Every moment of apparent nihilism contains within it the exact shape of what was lost to produce the nihilism. Every moment of apparent affection is more meaningful because of everything Rick has done to prevent himself from feeling it. The layers work in both directions, and the show never points at them and says, "Look at this." It just leaves them there, visible to the patient and the curious. This quality is also, in part, why the show's cultural impact has been so durable. Shows that give you everything on first viewing tend to exhaust themselves quickly. Shows that withhold something, that require you to bring yourself to them repeatedly in order to receive the full measure of what they offer, build audiences who feel genuinely invested. Rick and Morty built that audience. They are still building it. One fact and one hidden detail and one quietly devastating musical choice at a time. The show is not always successful. There are episodes that don't quite work, jokes that don't quite land, seasons that feel less fully realized than the ones surrounding them. This is true of any long-form creative work. But the failures are always interesting failures, because they occur within an ambition that is consistently trying to do something difficult. A show that never attempts anything genuinely hard cannot fail in interesting ways. Rick and Morty attempts genuinely hard things in nearly every episode, and that aspiration is why it has the particular hold on its audience that it does. You have just spent this time with 175 facts and the histories and mysteries that live inside them. You know more about how this show was made and why it works the way it does than when we started. And hopefully the next time you watch an episode, something you learned tonight will surface at exactly the right moment. A detail will click into place, a connection will reveal itself that wasn't visible before, and you'll feel, for a moment, the particular pleasure of understanding something more completely than you did before. That is the promise Rick and Morty makes. And across more than a decade of episodes, it has kept it more often than not. Sleep well. A note on the world of Rick and Morty. Beyond the screen. One dimension of the show's legacy that deserves its own acknowledgement is the way it has influenced adjacent creative worlds. The video game High on Life, developed by Justin Roiland's studio Squanch Games before his departure from the company, is set in what the developers described as the same creative universe, sharing visual sensibilities, humor styles, and even some voice cast members with Rick and Morty. Characters from the show appear as minor references in the game's dialogue, and the interactive format allowed the show's brand of improvised, slightly chaotic comedy to find a new expression. Players could pause in front of a television in the game and watch extended segments of fake programming, echoing the interdimensional cable episodes that are among the show's most beloved formats. The Rick and Morty comics, published through Oni Press, have expanded the universe in directions the television show has not pursued, introducing alternate versions of established characters, exploring backstories that the television narrative has kept vague, and occasionally contradicting established canon in ways that the show's own writers later addressed or acknowledged. The comics exist in a complicated canonical relationship with the television series. They are officially licensed, but not officially canon, which gives their writers a creative freedom that comes with its own specific pleasures and limitations. The animated universe has also been expanded by the Rick and Morty anime, which premiered in 2024 and brought Japanese animation sensibilities to the same characters and world. The anime is notable for several reasons beyond the obvious novelty of the format shift. It was produced by Telecom Animation Film, a studio with a long history in the genre, and the result shows a genuine engagement with the aesthetic traditions of anime, rather than simply applying a different visual style to identical content. Character movements, scene compositions, and emotional beats are all inflected by anime conventions in ways that produce something that is genuinely both things at once. The merchandise universe around Rick and Morty has become extensive enough to constitute its own category of cultural production. But beyond the obvious t-shirts and action figures, there are themed experiences, interactive events, officially licensed food products, and crossover promotions with brands ranging from potato chip manufacturers to video game publishers. The Pickle Rick Pringles flavor, released in collaboration with the show, represents a moment where the fictional transformation of a character into a food product was itself marketed as a food product. The layers of meta-reference involved are consistent with the show's own aesthetic. The show has also entered the canon of works cited in academic discussions about nihilism in popular media, existentialist themes in animation, the relationship between comedy and grief, and the use of science fiction as a vehicle for philosophical inquiry. Essays referencing Rick and Morty appear in publications dedicated to philosophy, cultural studies, media studies, and psychology. The show has generated enough serious critical attention to establish it as a legitimate object of academic analysis, which would have seemed improbable during the days when its origin was a crude, Back to the Future parody made to annoy a lawyer. All of this is to say that what began as an accidental act of creative frustration in 2006, a short film made to provoke a copyright dispute, has become something genuinely large and genuinely lasting. The universe of Rick and Morty is still expanding. New episodes are still being made. New versions of the characters are finding new audiences in new formats and new languages. The specific gravity of what Harmon and Roiland built, and even accounting for all the turbulence and difficulty of how the show's history has unfolded, remains powerful enough to keep pulling things into its orbit. That is a remarkable thing for any creative work to be. And every fact in this video, from the most obscure background detail to the deepest layer of character lore, is part of how it got to be that way.